Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Kynaston from the Lit and Phil, and I'd like to welcome you to tonight's event. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Over to tonight's event. Henrietta Heald is an author and editor whose particular interests include British history, architecture, feminism, and the countryside. She is a great friend and supporter of the Lit and Phil and has lectured and written on subjects inextricably linked to the Society. She is author of Magician of the North, a biography of William Armstrong, the great inventor and industrialist, who was also a president of the Lit and Phil for 40 years. This book was shortlisted for the Portugal Prize and the Best First Biography Prize. Henrietta is also the creator of the Parsons Town website, celebrating the genius of the Parsons family. Charles Parsons himself was also a president of the Lit and Phil. Tonight's talk appropriately takes place on International Women in Engineering Day. Please welcome Henrietta Heald, who will be discussing her most recent book, Magnificent Women and Their Revolutionary Machines. Thank you, Henrietta.
Thank you, Kay, very much indeed. Good evening, and a very warm welcome to everyone. I'm really thrilled to be back at the Lit and Phil, even though, of course, it's only virtual, sadly. But as it happens, today we're meeting at a very propitious moment because today is the annual International Women in Engineering Day, known for short as INWED. And this is just one of hundreds of events being held around the world to mark the occasion. INWED was the brainchild of the Women's Engineering Society, the inspiration for my book, Magnificent Women and Their Revolutionary Machines, which I shall be speaking about this evening. So can I start by sharing my screen with you? So, there we are. So Magnificent Women was first published in hardback in 2019 to mark the centenary of the Women's Engineering Society. And it's recently come out in paperback, generating a good deal of interest. But before introducing you to the trailblazers who founded the Society, just after the First World War, I'd like to mention a new online bookshop, bookshop.org, that passes on a percentage of all its sales income to independent bookstores, which have been going through a difficult time during the pandemic, so it is a cause worth supporting. If you'd like to buy a copy of Magnificent Women, bookshop.org is an attractive alternative to Amazon. And you can find links to this and other resources on the website, parsonstown.info. I should be happy to answer questions at the end of the talk, but I should point out that I am not myself an engineer, so I'm no good on the technical stuff. My interest here is in telling inspiring stories about fascinating people whose achievements have been largely forgotten. Magnificent Women was published on the 4th of March, UNESCO World Engineering Day for Sustainable Development, whose central message is that in order to solve the world's most pressing problems, climate change, global poverty, growing inequalities, we are in urgent need of millions more engineers, women as well as men. This is relevant because my book is about the future as well as the past. By exploring the stories of pioneering women in history, I hope to highlight the multitude of exciting opportunities offered by engineering in its many different forms, and to encourage more young people to consider a career in the profession. I must just mention here that I spent this afternoon at a fascinating Green Economy Summit, which was organised jointly by Newcastle University and the combined North of Tyne Authority, where the message came through time and time again that a key to delivering on the net zero targets for 2030 and beyond was skills, and more engineering skills. So March, the month of publication, was also Women's History Month. So it seemed that there was no better time to celebrate the achievements of women engineers of the past, especially since some of the individuals at the heart of my book took an active role in the suffragette movement before the First World War, including Katharine and Rachel Parsons, two of the founders of the Women's Engineering Society. As many of you will know, Katharine and Rachel were respectively the wife and daughter of Charles Parsons, the engineering genius who developed the steam turbine, making possible two world-changing achievements, revolutionising the propulsion of ships and generating electricity on a vast scale. I know I don't need to remind you that Charles Parsons was president of the Lytton Phil from 1916 until his death in 1931. In this role, he was following in the footsteps of one of his great mentors, Sir William Armstrong, later Lord Armstrong of Cragside, the Society's president from 1860 to 1900. Armstrong, as Kay mentioned, was the subject of my biography, Magician of the North, and it was research for this earlier book that first introduced me to the Parsons family. Incidentally, Katharine and Rachel Parsons were also members of the Lytton Phil, which had admitted women as early as 1804, just a decade after its founding. It is worth highlighting that Charles Parsons' presidency began in 1916, in the middle of the First World War, at a time when he was also serving as chairman of the Ministry of Munitions Board of Management in Tyne and Wear. This was a little publicised fact which is relevant to my story that I discovered while doing research in the archives of the Science Museum. Charles is best remembered today, of course, as the creator of the little ship Turbinia, which he built to test his steam turbine engines and which now occupies the Central Hall of Discovery Museum. He had grown up as part of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy at Birr Castle in the geographical centre of Ireland, and he was educated at Trinity College Dublin and St John's Cambridge before moving north in the 1870s to take up a premium apprenticeship at Armstrong's Elsit Works on the Tyne. From that time until his death in the 1930s, he and his family lived in Northumberland, and Charles set up his own engineering works at Heaton and Wallsend. It appears that Charles Parsons never doubted that women were as capable as men at carrying out skilled engineering tasks. Indeed, Rachael Parsons' love of engineering, which began in childhood, was encouraged by her father, with whom she spent many happy hours in his home workshop at Wylam. And she was inspired by his great achievements. She was educated at Rodine School in Brighton, a pioneering establishment in many ways, and particularly in that it taught science to girls. Rachel went on to become, in 1910, the first female student of mechanical sciences at Cambridge University. One of the themes that I explore in Magnificent Women is what led the extraordinary individuals who founded the Women's Engineering Society to get involved in engineering in the first place. In Rachel's case, I have no doubt that family influence played a very important part. Not only was she supported by both of her parents, but she was also heir to a brilliant scientific dynasty on both the male and female sides. Her paternal grandfather was the astronomer William Parsons, 3rd Earl of Ross, who in the 1840s had built on his estate at Birr, which was once known as Parsonstown, a telescope with a 6-foot diameter speculum. This instrument would acquire notoriety as the Leviathan of Parsonstown. 3 years after revealing the Leviathan to an incredulous world, William Ross was appointed president of the Royal Society, Britain's oldest and most august scientific body. He was later appointed as special advisor to the Prince Consort for the Great Exhibition of 1851, and more honours followed. Ross's inventive genius and the significance of his contribution to the advance of human knowledge are beyond doubt. But less widely recognised is the fact that his achievements would not have been possible without the support of two remarkable women. He owed a supreme debt to his wife, Mary, who provided intellectual, practical, and financial assistance. Mary Ross's wide-ranging education had included astronomy, and by the time the Leviathan came to be built, she knew enough about its subject to help her husband with his calculations. Even more unusually for a woman of her class, she was a skilled blacksmith, and much of the ironwork that supported the telescope was made by her. Mary also embarked on an experimental venture to record in images the groundbreaking developments that were taking place at Burr, for she was a pioneer in the art of photography. Her darkroom was closed up after her death, only to be rediscovered intact 100 years later, with all its original equipment and shelves of bottled chemicals, representing a treasure trove for the historians of the art. Ambitiously, Mary sought to record the development of the monster telescope, often including human figures in her compositions to emphasize the instrument's giant proportions. The second exceptional woman to whom William Ross owed so much was his first cousin and neighbour, Mary Ward. Although she became well known in her time as an artist, a naturalist, astronomer and microscopist, Mary Ward never received any formal marks of distinction, reflecting the virtual impossibility at the time for women to achieve recognition in the scientific field. Held in the highest regard by her cousin and his family, Mary Ward used her artistic talents to sketch each stage of the construction of the Leviathan, providing an invaluable record for contemporary and future astronomers. One of her books was a popular guide to astronomy, in which she explained from her own experience how to get the most from a small telescope. The fact is that in the Parsons family, women were thought capable of doing everything men could do and more. Growing up with this powerful inheritance and bolstered by the support of her parents, it's perhaps not surprising that Rachel Parsons developed a deep passion for engineering and a determination not to be thwarted in pursuing it as a career. We left Rachel as the first female student of engineering at Cambridge, a few years before the outbreak of the First World War. During the war, when her brother Tommy went off to the front, she was appointed a director of her father's firm, C.A. Parsons & Co. at Heaton, where she took charge of the hundreds of female workers involved in the manufacture of steam turbines for the use in electricity generation. Here is one of those workers, performing the intricate task of taping conductor ends. And here are two more images from the wartime album of the Heaton Works, which I was lucky enough to discover at Tyne and Wear Archives. Rachel later joined the training department of the Ministry of Munitions and travelled around the country instructing women in all sorts of engineering skills. In this, she was probably again encouraged by her father, who, as I mentioned earlier, was an influential figure in the ministry. The war was a critical spur to the creation of the Women's Engineering Society, whose founders had all played their part in it. Indeed, it was reckoned that in Britain alone, more than 1 million women had worked in the munitions industry. I should emphasise that there was a great deal more to munitions than the guns, bombs, shells and other items required on the battlefield. Any tool, machine or activity that was deemed vital to supporting the work of the armed forces came under the umbrella of the ministry, including the generation of electricity. Indeed, there was a massive demand for new turbine manufacture during the war, with hospitals, factories and transport systems all operating 24 hours a day. And fulfilling this demand was the main challenge for the Parsons Works at Heaton. Reflecting the telescope building legacy of Charles Parsons' parents, William and Mary Ross, the female workforce was also responsible for the production of optical munitions, including mirrors for searchlights, first used to light the Suez Canal. And during the war period, the factory's mirror department became the largest in the world. Meanwhile, at nearby Wallsend, the Parsons Marine Turbine Co. was building turbine engines for ships of the Royal Navy. When the war ended, female workers in industry were told that their services were no longer required, with the result that hundreds of thousands faced losing their jobs. And it was not just employment they were losing. For the first time, many of them had enjoyed an independent income that allowed them to live away from home. Work in the factories had brought other benefits, including good nutrition and healthcare to sustain a strong workforce, and some facilities offered state-sponsored childcare, as illustrated in this contemporary painting by Sir John Lavery of the nursery at the Royal Arsenal in Woolwich. In 1919, Rachel Parsons was installed as the first president of the Women's Engineering Society. This was less than a year after some women had been granted the right to vote for the first time and to stand in parliamentary elections. Writing in National Review magazine, Rachel exposed the extraordinary fact that although, as a result of the recent Sex Disqualification Removal Act, women could now become MPs, doctors, lawyers, and scientists, in the ranks of industry, they were in a worse position than before the war. Contrary to the fears of the male trade unions, women did not wish to undercut men's pay, she insisted. Rather, they were demanding equal pay for equal output. Rachel argued that the only way in which women could make headway in the industrial world was by organising themselves into a fighting force. It was useless, she said, for them to wait patiently for the closed doors of the skilled trade unions to swing open. Instead, they should form a strong alliance, which, bolstered by the parliamentary vote, would become as powerful an influence in safeguarding the interests of women engineers as the men's unions had been in improving the lot of their members. Women have won their political independence, she said. Now is the time for them to achieve their economic freedom too. Another moving force in the formation of the Women's Engineering Society was Rachel's mother, Katharine, Lady Parsons, who also provided the financial means to get the society off the ground. Although not herself a trained engineer, Katharine had helped her husband Charles set up his factories in Newcastle and had championed the employment of women in engineering and shipbuilding during the war. She was the first woman to be admitted to the North East Coast Institution of Engineers and Shipbuilders, to which she gave an influential victory speech in July 1919, lavishing praise on women's achievements in the fields of optical munitions. We are all familiar with the beautiful beams of light travelling over the sky in the search for Zeppelin and aircraft, she said. Here on the Tyne, we may feel a great pride in the mirrors and searchlights, as most of us know that Tyneside girls polished the mirrors and so added to the brilliancy of the searchlights. Katharine articulated the widespread anger at the introduction of the Restoration of Pre-War Practices Bill, which threatened to make it illegal for a woman to be employed in any engineering trade where female workers had not been employed before the war. Training girls and women for munitions works was reckoned to have cost £30 million, which is perhaps 1.5 billion in today's money. But the services of more than 1 million prospective weld producers had now been dispensed with. It has been a strange perversion of women's sphere, she said, to make them work at producing the implements of war and destruction, and to deny them the privilege of fashioning the munitions of peace. The Pre-War Practices Bill was the consequence of an agreement between the all-male engineering unions and David Lloyd George, the Minister of Munitions, who later, of course, became Prime Minister. It had been forged in early 1915 during a massive recruitment drive for industrial workers to take up the jobs vacated by fighting men. And Lloyd George had coaxed the unions to accept what was called dilution, which was the entry of unskilled workers of both sexes into jobs traditionally held by men, skilled men, on condition that wage levels would be maintained and dilution would last only as long as the war itself. The unions feared not only losing their jobs to women, but also that women would accept lower wages than men for the same work, leading to a reduction in status of the work and a general cut in pay rates. Disgust at the proposed implementation of the Pre-War Practices Bill was shared by all the founders of the Women's Engineering Society, and it united them in a campaign to oppose it. But among the trailblazers were women from a much less privileged background than the Parsons duo. At the other end of the social scale was Laura Annie Wilson, who had started work at a textile mill in Halifax, West Yorkshire, at the age of 10. She became a campaigner for workers' rights and an ardent suffragette, and she was twice imprisoned for her political activities. During the First World War, Laura Annie and her husband, who is shown here with their son and daughter, adopted their machine tool factory in Halifax to become a munitions facility with a largely female workforce, something that was happening all over Britain. And one of her many innovations was to set up works canteens, which had been almost non-existent before then. And she was stimulated to do this by realizing that some of her workers were actually starving themselves in order to feed their children. And so the idea of the canteens was to prevent that. And of course, the idea caught on all over the country very quickly. Laura Annie Wilson was awarded an MBE for her wartime munitions work. She was one of the first cohorts to receive an order of the British Empire. And she would go on to design and build hundreds of houses for working people in Halifax and in several towns in Surrey, some of them equipped with electricity. She described house building as very much a woman's business and a form of engineering of the domestic kind. Among the other founders of the Engineering Society was Margaret Robertson, known as Madge, who had studied mathematics at Cambridge before training and working as a maths teacher. But her real passion was motor engineering, and she spent several months training at the British School of Motoring in workshop practice and driving, at the end of which she was awarded a Royal Automobile Club's driver's certificate. In 1917, Madge had become works superintendent at Galloway Engineering Company at Tongland, near Kirkcudbright, in the southwest corner of Scotland, where most of the employees were female. Here are a few of them. Before and after the war, Tongland made automobiles, one called the Galloway, which was designed by women specifically for women drivers, but its munitions work involved the manufacture of aircraft parts. Madge used to astonish the locals by dashing around the countryside, if I can find her, on one of her much-loved motorbikes, a pastime thought to be quite unsuitable for a woman. Madge later took up a career in electrical engineering and joined forces with her friend Margaret Partridge in a pioneering venture to electrify villages in Devon. Here she is on the left, with Margaret Partridge, third from left. And between them is Beatrice or Tilly Shilling, also a leading light of the Engineering Society and an early employee of Margaret Partridge, who was greatly impressed by the younger woman's abilities. Tilly made her name in the Second World War with her invention of a device to protect Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft from crashing during combat, which was reckoned to have saved many lives. It was a circular disc inserted into the carburettor that prevented the fuel from flowing away from where it was needed during a dive, a phenomenon known as negative gravity. The device acquired the unfortunate label of Miss Shilling's orifice. On the right of the photograph is Caroline Hazlitt, who was the first secretary of the Women's Engineering Society, whom I shall come to later. Another Margaret who would go on to make her mark in the electrical world was Lady Moyer. She championed the formation in the mid-1920s of the Electrical Association for Women, of which she became president in 1934. The EAW was an offshoot of the Women's Engineering Society that flourished for more than 50 years. Margaret Moyer had worked during the war as a lathe operator in a munitions factory. As the wife of the prominent Scottish civil engineer Sir Ernest Moyer, in whose bridge building, tunnelling and harbour project she took a keen interest. She liked to describe herself as an engineer by marriage. In the 1920s and 30s, domestic electricity was in its infancy, and like all revolutionary social innovations, was regarded with suspicion. But Margaret Moyer insisted that the dawn of an all-electric era is at hand. And she had no doubt about the importance of this development in freeing women to pursue careers outside the home. It is essential that women become electrically minded, she said. Only by doing so will they learn to value electricity's cheapness and utility and regard it as a power to rescue them from all unnecessary household labours. The most colourful and perhaps the most enigmatic member of the group that founded the Engineering Society was Eleanor Lady Shelley Rolls, an experienced balloonist, the sister of the late Charles Rolls, with whom she shared a passion for speed and danger. Charles had partnered Henry Royce in a fabulously successful automobile production business set up in 1906 until he was killed in a flying accident 4 years later at the age of only 32. After the death of her two remaining brothers during the war, Lady Shelley Rolls became heir to a large fortune and the Hendry, a family mansion and estate outside Monmouth. On her marriage in 1898 to Sir John Shelly, a great nephew of the poet Shelley, the couple changed their name to Shelley Rolls. And here she is with Charles on the right and her husband John behind her, about to take off on one of their many ballooning expeditions. Her considerable fortune and her passion for powered flight made Lady Shelley Rolls an important patron of the female aviators who would make their presence felt in the Women's Engineering Society in the 1930s and 1940s. And prominent among these were Dorothy Spicer and Pauline Gower, who trained as pilots before setting up their own air taxi business, and Amy Johnson, the first woman to fly solo from England to Australia, and that was in 1930. Amy Johnson and Dorothy Spicer were the first women to hold licenses as ground engineers, and Amy served as president of the Engineering Society from 1935 to 1937. She's often portrayed as a glamorous daredevil who finally overreached herself when she was killed in a plane crash in the Thames estuary in 1941, but there was far more to Amy than that. Her skill as an engineer meant that during her long and lonely flights, she was able to repair and patch up her plane when it broke down or crashed, as it often did. During the Second World War, Pauline Gower set up and ran the women's section of the Air Transport Auxiliary, the ATA. A total of 166 women took to the air as ATA pilots. They were initially restricted to flying non-combat aircraft, but they were eventually allowed to fly virtually every type of aircraft flown by the RAF and the Fleet Air Arm, including four-engined heavy bombers, but not, of course, in battle. In the normal course of events, the paths of the women who founded the Engineering Society would have been unlikely to cross, but they had been drawn together by their wartime experiences and by trenchant opposition to the ousting of women workers from industry. They relished strides towards gender equality that had been made during the war, especially the opportunities that opened up for female technical education, and they fought hard to preserve those hard-won advantages. As it happened, despite their best efforts, the Restoration of Pre-War Practices Act became law towards the end of 1919. Laura Annie Wilson and her husband were successfully prosecuted and fined for continuing to employ women at their factory in defiance of the Act. But the campaign itself had forged a strong bond between this group of disparate women and had drawn into the fold an exceptional individual who had been hired by Katharine Lady Parsons as the first secretary of the Women's Engineering Society. Her name was Caroline Hazlitt. The daughter of a railway signalman from Sussex, Caroline had developed an early interest in women's rights, joining the Women's Social and Political Union at the age of 18, to the dismay of her narrowly conventional parents. Her lifelong mission was to liberate women from domestic drudgery through electrification of the home, allowing them the freedom to pursue the jobs and careers that would bring them personal satisfaction and financial independence. During the war, Caroline had acquired a basic training in electrical engineering at the Cochrane Boiler Works at Annan in Dumfriesshire, where as a woman she struggled to be taken seriously. After she joined the Engineering Society, however, her career went from strength to strength. In 1924, she was appointed the first director of the Electrical Association for Women, and she would go on to become the leading professional woman of her age. Among many other roles, she was made vice president and later president of the International Federation of Business and Professional Women, which gave her a global reach as a feminist campaigner. Caroline's crowning achievement occurred in 1947 when she became the first female member of the British Electricity Authority, a body set up to run the electricity industry under state ownership. And in that same year, she was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, the first and one of the very few female engineers to gain such an honour. Like most of the other women I've mentioned, Caroline served her term as president of the Women Engineering Society. And here she is, flanked by two other former presidents. On the left is Laura Annie Wilson, and on the right is Margaret Partridge, the electrical engineer and businesswoman. In contrast to the stellar professional career enjoyed by Caroline Hazlitt, Rachael Parsons' life took a very different turn. As the gifted daughter of an engineering genius, this energetic campaigner for women's rights turned her attention to the political sphere, believing that this was the only way to bring about real and lasting change. She secured a place as one of the few women on the London County Council, which later became the Greater London Council. And in 1923, she stood unsuccessfully for Parliament at a time when there were only 2 women MPs. Rachel had seemed set to make a lasting mark on the world. In the event, however, she was thwarted in most of her ambitions and turned to a life of social convention, which never satisfied her. Here she is in one of her many fast cars, a Buick, outside her grand home in central London in the mid-1920s. As time passed, she became increasingly disillusioned, with the result that she retreated into solitude and loneliness. The young woman who had so impressed the other Women's Engineering Society founders with her verve, articulacy, and freedom of spirit would end her life in dramatic tragedy. But that is another story. So, in conclusion, in the face of the extreme social pressures endured by women in the 1920s and 30s, the Women's Engineering Society provided a rallying point for independent-minded, visionary women who sought not only a good education and secure employment for themselves and others, but also a better, fairer world for all members of the female sex. These pioneers met many obstacles on the way, but they were united in their determination to bring about change. The fact they'd come together to form an organisation with a clearly defined mission to obtain proper recognition for women in the engineering profession and provide them with opportunities and facilities for training and employment gave them a unique strength and allowed them to do important work that will prepare the ground for the equality legislation, notably the Equal Pay Act and the Sex Discrimination Act that came into force in the 1970s. So I hope that this whistle-stop tour of the lives of early women engineers has not only introduced you to an array of fascinating characters, but also thrown a light on the wide range of activities that come under the umbrella of engineering. Even a century ago, this was far removed from the caricature of the man in the greasy boiler suit with spanner image that retains a strong hold on the popular imagination. And today, of course, the diversity of occupations and the opportunities that come with them is quite incredible. And the best way I can illustrate this is to quote from the afterword of my book, written by Dawn Childs, who is the current president of the Women's Engineering Society and is now UK Change Director at the National Grid, and whose own career highlights have included Head of Engineering at Gatwick Airport. The breadth and depth of roles in which female engineers now excel are truly staggering, she writes. Women are represented in every engineering discipline and sector: aeronautical, space, electrical, electronic, mechatronic, which is robotics, automotive, rail, biomedical, mechanical, civil, building services, environmental, agricultural, systems, nuclear, renewable energy, maritime, oil and gas, acoustic, leisure and entertainment, communications, and more. But I must add, there are still not nearly enough of them, especially in the UK, where females make up only about 12% of the UK engineering workforce. So if any of you are interested in finding out about more about a career in engineering for yourselves, your children, or your grandchildren, do have a look at the links to tomorrow's engineers and other organisations on the Parsons Town website. So thank you very much. And now back to Kay.
Well, thank you so much, Henrietta. If anybody has a question or a comment, please do use the chat facility, but perhaps I could start by asking you, Henrietta, of all the women that you've discussed tonight, who do you find the most inspirational and why?
Oh, that's such a difficult question to answer, because that, in a way, what has attracted me to this group of women, that they all, in their own way, do have their, because they all broke the bounds of convention. None of them lived, ordinary lives. I mean, very few of them married, and even few had children. But I suppose and I do have a sneaking admiration for Rachel, really, because although she obviously came from a background of privilege, and one question I often get asked is, did you have to be privileged in order to join this group? Which I hope I've shown you didn't have to be, because somebody like Laura Annie Wilson, really came from the absolutely, with no privileges at all in life. And but it actually gave her a gateway to something more influential position. And I suppose I also have to say that I do admire Caroline Hazlitt hugely, because she really did make a difference. Because not only was she was an engineer, but she was, in fact, sort of more motivated by the whole idea of changing women's lives by this electrification, which of course we now take so much for granted. But of course in the 1920s it was also new, and it really made such a huge difference in the end. I haven't really answered the question, but
yeah, thank you.
It has a multiple answers. I must just get reviewed.
Has anybody a question? Well, maybe another one for me, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. No, I'm not used to having no questions.
Somebody has asked a question. Do you think if more people learned about these women at school, it might inspire more interest in engineering as a career?
Oh, well, I do hope so. I mean, I really would hope that's the case. And that's something actually because the Women's Engineering Society is still going strong today. And it's one of their campaigns very much is to get into schools and to give talks and to inspire people. And that's why, they have these events like today's International Women Engineering Day. And there's actually another wonderful thing they do is, well, it's not just them actually, but there's the IET, Institution of Engineering and Technology, runs a Young Woman Engineer of the Year award, which is just a most incredible. They have the shortlist for these jobs, or just for this award is absolutely staggering. And the woman who won it actually designs McLaren racing cars. I mean, and the whole point of introducing people to that is to get the kind of spectrum, the wide range of opportunities. And I just think that if girls understood that more, just what the possibilities were, and teachers too, of course. I mean, teachers need to, because people often say, well, they were never given any guidance towards engineering at school. So I do think that teachers need to kind of take the bull by the horns as well.
Yes. Chi, have you got a question there?
Yes, thanks. Hi, and thanks, Henrietta. That was fantastic, and I was a great fan of your previous book, The Magician of the North, about William Armstrong. And in fact, interestingly, so today I led a debate on the Tyne Bridge, the restoration of the Tyne Bridge, and as part of that, and as part of INWED, I championed the history of Dorothy Buchanan, who was one of the designers of the Tyne Bridge, and based in Dorman Long in Middlesbrough, and was also the first woman engineer to enter the Institute of Civil Engineers, so the first women's chartered civil engineer in 1927. And I suppose there's just two things. So do you feel that there more? Do you think there are more women engineers out there whose contribution is unrecognised? But then also, I know that Rachael Parsons was politically conservative, and I did wonder if her experience with trade unions contributed to that. So I wondered. I'm quite biased in that, by the way.
I know the strange thing is, although she stood as a conservative, I mean, first of all, yes, it was because of the trade unions, because they did actually, they completely shut the door on women, and of course it was a closed shop, and so they just would not even enter into discussions with them. And in fact, it took until I think after the Second World War until the Associated Union of Engineers actually allowed women to join. So yeah, there was a great deal of hostility, and of course the women weren't happy with that. But also, what's strange, if you read her speeches that she gave when she was a candidate, actually a lot of her sentiments were more socialist than conservative. I mean, we would think now, if you read them without knowing her political affiliations, you'd think she was a socialist. So I think it has changed a lot. Our perception. She had to be in some degree as well, because she was standing in Ince, which was a neighbouring constituency to Wigan. So it was a very, very strongly Labour seat anyway. So she did have to, she had to sort of address herself. But always it was also, she was also talking about women having equal pay and equal employment rights. So she, again, it was not how we traditionally think of Conservatives.
Question from Somerville Sue. Back to schools, if I may. Women's opportunities should be promoted much more. Can we lobby to have something included in the curriculum?
Well, yes. And I think that's absolutely what we should be doing. I think actually we need to get the influential people in the engineering world to do just that, because especially when we have this huge skills shortage at the moment, I mean, it obviously makes sense for there to be. I'm just wondering if there are. I don't know of any actual courses that are run at schools on engineering. I mean, I don't know if Chi knows any, but I think that's an excellent idea. We should do it.
Well, if not, I'd just like to thank Henrietta again for her fantastic, inspirational talk. In fact, it was so interesting to hear about people who have been invisible, many of whom we've never heard of before, or I certainly hadn't heard of before. Just bringing them to light and just highlighting their significance and their contribution really to society. And the more we can find out about these women, the better.
Actually, sorry to interrupt you, Kay, but I just realised I hadn't answered Chi's second question, which was about are there other women who haven't been recognised? And I think absolutely yes. And in fact, one of the things in my book is that I have got a milestones for women section at the back, which because I'm in the book, the story actually finishes in the 1950s. But after that, I've tried to chronicle all the milestones that women had achieved in the engineering and slightly wider field, actually, in the related fields, right up to the present time. So and there are a huge number of them. So yeah, there's a lot more books to be written. Any aspiring writers out there? lots more subject matter. Sorry, I just apologise for interrupting you.
That's no problem. And someone on chat is just saying thank you for the talk, and thanks for putting these women more on the map. So I'd like to echo that finally, on behalf of ourselves here tonight, on behalf of Lit and Phil, thank you so much for being part of our programme. It's really appreciated. And with that, shall we say good night, and hope to see you again in the library very soon, Henrietta.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Kay. Lovely.
Good night. Good night, everyone.
Bye.